So the law of syllogism allows you to state a conclusion from two true conditional statements when the conclusion of one statement is the hypothesis of the other. Sometimes it's called a logical chain. And so basically, in my mind, I think of it as like the domino effect, right? So if one thing happens, it pushes over the next domino and so forth and so on, right? And so here's an example, and hopefully it'll make a little more sense this way. Number one, if it is July, then you're on summer vacation. So the original hypothesis, if it is July, so it is July, and the conclusion, you are on summer vacation, right? So then the next statement says, if you're on summer vacation, so the hypothesis of that, of the second conditional matches up with the conclusion of the first. Then it says, then you work at a smoothie shop. So you work at a smoothie shop is the conclusion. So if it is July, then you're on summer vacation. If you're on summer vacation, then you work at a smoothie shop. So if both of those conditional statements are true, if it's July, then that'll mean you're on summer vacation. If you're on summer vacation, then you work at a smoothie shop. So we can go straight from the hypothesis of one to the conclusion of the other, right? So we can go straight to say, well, if it's July, then you work at a smoothie shop, right? And that's the law of syllogism. All right, so we can make that conclusion. And notice how this is the hypothesis of the first, conclusion of the second. So we basically skip that middle one, right? The second domino. All right. And so we can liken this to the transitive property of equality that says if A equals B and B equals C, then A must equal C, right? All right, let's try another. To take calculus, you must first take algebra 2. To take algebra 2, you must first take algebra 1. Okay, so you are taking calculus. So in other words, let's make this into true more structured conditional. If you take calculus, then you must take algebra 2. Or if taking calculus, or if you are taking calculus, then you must have taken algebra 2, right? If you've taken algebra 2, or if you take algebra 2, then you must take algebra 1, right? So if you're in calculus, then you must have had to take algebra 2, right? If you took algebra 2, that matches up with the previous conclusion, then you must have had to take algebra 1, right? So here we can say, okay, well, we're taking calculus, so it follows that, okay, well, you must have taken algebra 1. Okay, so we can go straight from the original hypothesis of the first statement to the conclusion of the second, right? If you take calculus, then you have taken algebra 1, right? And then we can conclude by the law of detachment that, hey, you must have taken algebra 1, right? If you've taken calculus. All right. Number 3 says, if the sum of the digits in a number is 9, then the number is divisible by 9. Which, by the way, is a cool trick to find, to determine if a number is divisible by 9, right? And then the next statement says, if a number is divisible by 9, then it's divisible by 3. Okay. So the hypothesis of the first is the sum of the digits in a number is 9. The conclusion of the first is the number is divisible by 9, right? So the hypothesis of the second, a number is divisible by 9, matches up with the conclusion of the first. So the law of syllogism can take effect, and the final conclusion is it is divisible by 3. So we can go straight from, with the law of syllogism, we can go straight from if the sum of the digits in a number is 9, then it is divisible by 3, right? Because the conclusion of the first matches up with the hypothesis of the second. Okay, so that's the law of syllogism. Then we can look at the information given. It says the sum of the digits of a number 9, right? So that means we can conclude that it is divisible by 3 by the law of detachment. Okay, so we make our statement using the law of syllogism, and then we can use the law of detachment to make a conclusion. All right, so there it is. The law of syllogism tells us that if the sum of the digits is in a number is 9, then it's divisible by 3. And the conclusion we can make is, well, if we're given that the sum of the digits in a number is 9, then we can say, oh yeah, well, it's divisible by 3. Because they gave us the hypothesis, right? So if they give us the hypothesis, we can assume the conclusion. All right, so trial number 4. They give us this information in the middle, but kind of ignore that ignore that to the end. So the two conditional statements: if you live in the Bronx, then you live in New York. Next statement: if you live in New York, then you live in the 11th state to enter the Union. Okay, so try to use the law of syllogism to connect those and make one conditional statement, and then use Tracy lives in the Bronx to make a conclusion based on the law of detachment. And remember, if you feel that the law of syllogism doesn't apply, or the law of detachment does not apply, you can say no conclusion, or does not apply. Okay. All right, and then finally number 5, if two angle measures sum to 180, so that's our two angle measures sum to 180, our initial hypothesis, then the angles are supplementary. The next statement, if two angles measure sum to 90, so here this is a whole different statement, right? Two angle measures sum to 90, that doesn't match up with the conclusion, right, of the original. Then it says then their angles are complementary, so another new statement, right? So those two conditional statements are not linked by the conclusion of one and the hypothesis of the other, right? So if we're trying to use law of syllogism here, it does not apply, right? So we cannot make any conclusions. We cannot use the law of syllogism here because this and this don't match up, okay? So you can say law of syllogism, we'll just say LOS does not apply. All right, or no conclusion can be made. And just a tip here, and also just remember that you don't necessarily have to remember the names of these. Like, I won't necessarily test you on the names of them, but just make sure you understand the principles, right? And in class, of course, we'll use the names and, hopefully remember them by name. But more importantly, the law of syllogism, when you have two conditionals and the conclusion of one matches up with the hypothesis of another, you can go straight from the hypothesis of the first to the conclusion of the second. All right. So kind of like the domino effect, like we said. And so you use that when you have two conditionals, right? When you're given two conditionals. So that's kind of a tip to see, oh yeah, this is what's going on here. The law of detachment is used when you have one conditional. And so obviously sometimes you go for law of syllogism, you used to go from 2 to 1, and then you can use the law of detachment with your resulting conditional statement. So, all right, so when you have one conditional, use law of detachment. When you have two conditionals, law of syllogism. And sometimes use them in conjunction, like we talked about. All right, let me know if you have any questions. You can write them down, bring them to class, email me, and I will see you in class.